All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so delighted to welcome you all here for today's book talk in celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month, featuring Carrie Gibson and her book, El Norte, the epic and forgotten story of Hispanic North America. My name's Lisa Goodman, and I'm the director of the Law Library. I'm so thrilled and honored that the Latinx Law Students Association invited the library to partner with them in hosting this book talk. Carrie Gibson is a US-born, UK-based historian and journalist. She received her PhD from Cambridge in 2011, and her thesis focused on the Hispanic Caribbean in the era of the Haitian Revolution. She's the author of the 2014 book, Empire's Crossroads, A History of the Caribbean from Columbus to Present Day. Her second book, which we'll discuss today, El Norte, was published in 2019 and shortlisted for the Mark Linton History Prize in 2020. She's spent years traveling and researching in the Caribbean, Latin America, and the United States. Before embarking on a career as a historian, Carrie was a journalist for The Guardian and Observer and continues to contribute to media outlets, including the BBC. She lives in London, where she's joining us from. We'll start with some opening remarks about the book from Carrie, and then we'll move into a little bit of commentary from our very own Professor Guillermo Garcia Sanchez, who was born and raised in Mexico and whose scholarship focuses on US-Mexico energy relations, after which we'll open it up for Q&A, and I'll keep the queue at that point. So welcome everyone, and I'll turn it over to Carrie.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's slightly terrifying to be talking to so many lawyers at the same time, I have to say. No, but thank you so much for the invite. Thank you, Lisa, for that very kind introduction, to Fabiola for inviting me initially, and of course to Guillermo, who I'm very much looking forward to speaking to. So I just want to tell you a bit about the book for those of you who haven't read it, and I totally appreciate that law students have a lot of other reading to do, but should you find yourself with a bit of spare time, it's just another big tome to open up. So this is El Norte, and what I do in it is I start with Columbus and I go up to the present day. It is a sort of large narrative history designed for a non-specialist audience. So I start with that first encounter and then everything that kind of follows in what becomes the United States. So I kind of focus on the North American landmass. I try to cover East and West evenly. I think sometimes this story gets a bit sort of heavy on the Western side. And so I try to kind of keep bringing in Florida, bringing in the kind of Georgia, South Carolina borderlands, kind of early excursions by the Spanish into what becomes, South Carolina, things like that. I try to look at a lot of things. I cram a lot in. So I've got 18th century geopolitics. I've got the big events like the Mexican-American War. But I also kind of try to give a sense of how people lived as well as I can. And certainly when I get into the chapters in the 20th century, this becomes easier to do. There's more sources. There's a lot to talk about, things like education, housing, and that sort of stuff. And it's woven in through the narrative. So the book is organized through time, and it tends to focus a bit on place. So with a lot of the chapters, I try to situate the chapter around a certain place as well. So like the Alamo or Nooka Sound in the Pacific Northwest, which you'll have to read the book to find out why I chose that one. But basically to kind of take you through this story. Now, on the subtitle, I have Forgotten, so the epic and forgotten story of Hispanic North America. And I use forgotten in a really provocative sense because for many of you, this is not a forgotten story, and that is also the case for millions of people in the US. It's very much a lived one, it's very much a familial one, but I argue in the book that it doesn't get the place it deserves in the larger national narrative, and that's why I kind of want to put the idea of forgotten right out there on the title. So the other thing I'll just speak about briefly, like in this little introduction, is why did I write this book? Because I get asked that a lot. So there's kind of three main reasons. And the first kind of relates back to a formative experience. I grew up in Dalton, Georgia. So I've lived in Britain for a long time, and I'll come to that in a minute. But I grew up in Dalton, and in 1990, when I started high school, the Hispanic population of Dalton was around 6%. And then today, when the last census, it's at 46%. Now, Dalton is a town of about 30,000 people. And the first kind of big wave of immigrants came while I was in high school. And this is very much the era of NAFTA. So we went from being, quite a small school in quite a small town to seeing lots of immigrants from Mexico come. So by my senior year, we were doing bilingual morning announcements and that sort of thing. And as I say, this is kind of the era of NAFTA. There was a visa scheme. There were teachers going from Dalton to northern Mexico. There were people coming from northern Mexico to work in the carpet mills of Dalton. And so that was kind of my first introduction to sort of Mexican culture, and that's changed a lot even in Dalton, because now a lot of the immigrants are from other parts of Central America. Some of them don't speak Spanish, they speak indigenous languages, because I went back to Dalton to revisit it. So I kind of bookend El Norte with Dalton sort of then and Dalton now. In my own personal life, I grew up Catholic, so watching Catholic church in Dalton kind of double in size was quite interesting. And I also have Italian grandparents who came over after the war. So, there are elements of the immigration story that I understand, but mine are from Italy. And one of the things that I puzzled over as kind of looking back at that time and looking kind of at the state of the world, when I first started thinking about this book, was why are Hispanic people, why has the Hispanic community as a group been put in a different category, to sort of Italian Americans or Irish Americans who have been assimilated into a certain type of whiteness. And I really wanted to think about that. I wanted to also think about where that fits with this longer story, with the story of the border crossing, as people say in the West, the border crossed us, we didn't cross the border. And I wanted to think about that diversity, which of course brings up all kinds of questions about, whiteness and mestizaje and racism and language and religion and all kinds of stuff. So all of that's crammed into the book too. I try to address it and think about it the best I can. And the other thing behind that is I moved to London in 1999, and Britain at that time was kind of having a multicultural moment, which we can now see was actually more of an exception than a rule because of everything that happened in Brexit. But I remember being very struck at the time of the US election. So I was kind of watching the 2012 election, and it's like, God, little did we know what was going to happen. But this is like back in 2012, and kind of thinking about all these sort of things, and just really surprised at the rhetoric and the kind of language used about immigration and that sort of thing. And it really struck me that the US hadn't kind of moved on, and I was living in like multicultural Britain. And of course, I got all of this very wrong, as 2016 kind of unfortunately showed me. But it was part of that that seed. Like, okay, so here are all these things that kind of happened. Here's a certain type of language being used. What's the bigger and fuller story? So that's kind of the first reason, where sort of all these sort of things floating around in my mind. And the second is that I am a historian of colonialism in the Spanish Caribbean, and this is my first book, Empire's Crossroads. So I have been working on the Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic in the colonial era for a long time, and in the context of the Haitian Revolution. So I had been thinking a lot about things like racialized fear, slavery, and all of that sort of stuff. So as I got into my kind of tentative research for El Norte, one of the things that I really noticed was how fragmented the historiography is. So you've kind of got Chicano Mexican history over here, and Cuban history there, and Puerto Rican history here. And I wanted to use El Norte to bring those things together and kind of give a larger picture, a larger vista of what's going on, and kind of connect the dots and present a bigger, panorama in terms of geography, diversity, and time. And then finally, I guess the third big reason I wanted to write this book was I feel like for a long time, this language and this debate about immigration and the border has really overshadowed kind of longer struggles, longer patterns, this bigger history. I mean, the Spanish have been poking around North America since 1513, and the English don't even put a colony in Jamestown until 1607. It's, you know, whose colony is it anyway? And it's not that I think that one empire is like better than the other, because that's entirely the wrong question. But what I wanted to do, and this is very key to the book, is that I wanted to situate the United States, which for such a long time has presented itself as exceptional to the rest of the world, and actually say, no, you're part of Spanish America too. You know, so the history of Cuba and the history of Argentina, and history of Peru and history of Mexico, yeah, the US shares that with them. And so that was a very key part of the book. And so, yeah, so that's a bit about the book and why I wrote it. And I think I've probably talked enough. So I will stop there and start with conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carrie. I really enjoyed reading your book. It was eye-opening for me. And I wanted to share an anecdote with you and with the audience. So I think the book is not only, I know you make a huge effort to, you know, change the narrative in the United States, but I think this book is also a book that is worth reading on the Mexican perspective. Because I think one of the fascinating things as a Mexican that was raised in Mexico, learned history in Mexico, is that also the history of Hispanic North America is shrugged under the rug in Mexico, because it's such a painful part of Mexican identity, right? Every time Mexico talks about Texas, California, New Mexico, these are the lost territories in the war, the territories that were taken away from Mexico. And there's always this feeling that whoever, if you are Mexican, you live across the border, you left the nation and you went to live, you know, on those territories that left Mexico. So even for us, a Mexican, like learning the history, I think it built that a big gap, right? For my understanding of what Mexico is and Mexican identity. And I think even on the Mexican side, the whole idea of mestizaje and trying to figure out what it is to be Mexican and what is not to be Mexican. It's even a conversation is happening right now in Mexico, because, you know, the new administration is going to a review of history and try to identify what it is to be a Mexican and the independence of Mexico. So I want to thank you at least to tell you that the book is not only changing narratives in the United States, but also changing some sort of narratives in Mexico. And I'm glad you started your comments talking about the efforts of the United States to create an own identity where other identities were left out. So Native Americans, African slaves, Hispanic America, all those were left out of the narrative of what it is to be the United States, at least at the beginning of the independence movement. But now we see a new push to talk about Hispanic History Month, and I want to start with that piece. Why do we, and you talk about this in this book, but maybe I think it's very important for our audience to understand, why do we celebrate Hispanic History Month and not Latino History Month, or, you know, Mexican Latino? Why the term Hispanic is such an important, or at least has a particular meaning when it comes to celebrating this identity in the United States?
Well, thank you for that. And I'm delighted to know that, you know, you speaking as a Mexican, this book was useful for you. Because that was one of the things I was very worried about too, is like kind of, you know, did I engage enough with Mexican historiography? You know, how does Mexico kind of view this history? And actually, and I should have to say, the side note, there's going to be a Spanish language version published next year. So for anyone who might want to read it in Spanish, it'll be coming out with Editorial IDAF in Spain, but hopefully there'll be a Kindle version. So yeah, so the word Hispanic, and I write about this in the book, because again, that's the other problematic word in my subtitle, is a contested one for sure. It is not a word that people necessarily think is inclusive. I think that's the biggest problem with it, is this idea that the Hispanicness of it kind of excludes, you know, people of African origin, people of indigenous origin. The reason I use it, and I suspect this is also links to the reason why we talk about Hispanic Heritage Month, is actually to link to that European, because also the word can also be configured, I think, to be inclusive, to consider that bigger sort of history, but it also connects it to Spain. And so I think it's certainly for me, I wanted to put it in the subtitle because I wanted to link it, because, you know, the Spanish really, in many ways, as an immigrant group, leave the story pretty early on. what we have are, are the descendants of, of Spanish people, of Africans, of, indigenous people, and that is kind of part of the story of the Americas more widely. And part of the reason I used Hispanic, though, is I wanted to signal that story that starts with Spain, that this starts with European colonialism, because I think European colonialism, has a lot to kind of answer for in terms of the development of the Americas, again, as a hemisphere, but also, of the United States. And it's really interesting because the US just doesn't think of itself in that kind of post-colonial context at all, in a way that if you talk about or read kind of scholarship about post-colonialities or post-colonialism in other places, like the US doesn't self-identify as that, which I think is really fascinating in a lot of ways. But yeah, I mean, Latino is a very different word, and it kind of comes, and I think people try to use them interchangeably, but to me, Latino is much more 20th century, and it very much indicates something within the US, because people tend to just identify themselves from their country of origin elsewhere, but in the US, you're Latino, and so it's also kind of a very interesting and fluid label or terminology, because it's also got, I think it's seen, and obviously, tell me if I'm a little off the mark here, as being kind of more political. It's a political kind of umbrella as well, where in some senses Hispanic is seen as being more cultural, the Spanish language, Cervantes, or whatever, that's kind of under that umbrella, and Latino is under a bit more, la lucha, like, things that are going on today and inequalities today. And so I think both words have their place and their meaning. And it's funny with Hispanic Heritage Month, because I was invited to give a different talk, and they had it as Hispanic / Latinx Heritage Month. Like they put the two terms together. So I think there's a lot going on in that conversation, and I don't think it's been resolved one way or the other. And I feel like there's still a lot of fluidity with what people choose to use and how they use both of those terms. But yeah, certainly with El Norte, the reason I focus more on Hispanic is I wanted to take it right back to, Castile and Aragon, so.
And do you think, I know you in the book, you talk, particularly when you talk about the history of New Mexico and trying to, apply to become a state, that was also a big part of the narrative, like arguing that, the folks that lived there had a Hispanic heritage, especially in the era of Jim Crow, because if they identify themselves as former Mexican nationals or Mexican Americans, that would raise a whole bunch of issues regarding segregation and the laws that were in place. So it was important for them to assert a Hispanity, a European connection, in order to avoid being classified, under more a darker skin or be segregated in certain neighborhoods. So I think that's, I don't know, that's also connected to why Hispanic Heritage Month became.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Sorry. And the whole Hispano thing in New Mexico is definitely obviously part of that as well. And I should say a little bit about that, because New Mexico, and I don't know if there's anyone from New Mexico here, but that kind of threw me at first when I was there, because people were like, oh, I'm not Latino, I'm Hispano, my family's Spanish. And I just think that's like, there's this kind of fascinating discourse there that's very distinct to kind of anywhere else. And it's got to be related, to the statehood battle. I think the roots are kind of there. And I write about this a bit in the book, because it's really fascinating how it takes New Mexico so much longer to become a state, because of various prejudices in Washington. And they kind of didn't know what to do with a territory that had so many Spanish speakers, that had a Spanish-speaking power structure that was often branded corrupt and backward and all the usual kind of pejorative things. But it took, New Mexico became a state in 1912, and the land was ceded in 1848. California becomes a state in 1850. New Mexico, it takes till the 20th century, and that has a lot to do with it. And so there was this idea that if we latch onto Hispano and we kind of present ourselves as kind of heirs to that European thread as well, and that sort of linked to Spain, that was definitely a little bit of what was going on at the time there too. But like that whole thing in New Mexico, I thought was really fascinating. I had never been to New Mexico until I started researching this book, and so that was like this kind of whole chapter. And again, I don't know for somebody who grew up in Mexico if you knew that story either, Guillermo, like if you were aware of kind of the New Mexican ideas about Hispanidad, you know.
No, we definitely had no. At least I didn't. We didn't. Again, this is part of a story that we in Mexico we don't tell. Also, it's just like Texas, the war, and then that's it. We forget about all that heritage. Now, since we're in Texas, I have to ask you: are there any particular events or parts of the history of Hispanic Texas that you think inform what Texas is today that are probably missed in many of the narratives or the common narratives here in Texas?
Wow, that's a really good question. So gosh, I kind of saw so much in Texas, but the thing that I found really interesting, and I don't know where it fits in kind of the Texas narrative, but I found it really worthwhile in a way, and also just because when it comes to historical sites, I try to go to them as much as I can, because I just think being in those spaces, even if now there's a museum and a gift shop or whatever, you know, just being in those spaces gives you a sense of kind of what's going on. And I found going to Washington on the Brazos really interesting, which is where, I mean, there's nothing there really. I mean, like, this is where Stephen Austin had his land grant, and you just think, well, you know, what is this? But within that is just there's just such a story about, you know, kind of US colonialism. And, you know, and again, like there's from what I remember, and I'd have to go back and look at my pictures and my notes, but, you know, there's nothing that, again, like, you know, Texas has such an issue with talking about its existence owing to the fact of these people wanting to keep slaves, you know, and the connection with that and Texas independence, again, is kind of written out. But to go to East Texas and kind of see, you know, how at the time I went, it was really green, and, you know, you're near the Gulf, and it kind of made sense. And what made sense about it was like how that creeping kind of encroachment of the US, and like how Mexico and why Mexico was worried about it, and how we think there are these spaces where they're just kind of, okay, there's not much there right now, but there was a lot there, and there was a lot going on. So like places to the naked eye that look like, well, I don't really see much, actually have a lot going on under the surface. And so I found like going around East Texas to be that, because also in East Texas, there are, I mean, at the moment, I think they're mostly markers. I feel like there's a couple of old ruins of some mission churches. And again, you know, there's a story there, like the Spanish really fail to put missions in East Texas because like the Caddo Indians weren't, I mean, there was a lot of resistance, you know. And again, these are like very small, are not talked about enough sort of stories. I mean, yes, we have the Alamo, and that is like the big site. But I found going to these kind of slightly more out of the way places, and slightly, you know, not quite on that track of Texas history. And the other thing too was just going down and literally looking at the border and following the border around for a bit, and realizing that you know, rivers shift. You know, why do we even think that this can be a stable boundary? And then there's the place in the middle of the river. Is it Chemisal? Am I saying that right? The bit of land that was contested. I mean, what a crazy history that is. And again, that's like quite an interesting sort of symbol of sort of US-Mexico relations. And also, just like I say, of this kind of insanity of trying to put a border on a river. I mean, it just doesn't, you know, how these things, kind of the, you know, geography kind of meets geopolitics. So yeah, within Texas, again, it's more like taking yourself away from the main sites and thinking about the landscape. I think there's a lot in that, especially like kind of, yeah, east and southern Texas.
Right. And before we started the everybody joining in, you were also telling us this, how impactful it was to see the Alamo, and how the narrative about what the Alamo represents for Texas vis-a-vis what you learned about, you know, the other things that are out of the narrative about what the Alamo is about.
Yeah, I mean, the Alamo, I mean, I don't even think we learned about it in Georgia. I mean, like I had to go back and kind of look up the Mexican-American War in a serious way, you know, when I went to this book. So it's like, it wasn't something I knew particularly well off the top of my head. And then I got there, And I mean, it's just a tiny Spanish mission church. Like, again, when you've seen other Spanish mission churches, it also puts it in that context. It wasn't the first time I'd ever seen a Spanish mission. And so having seen far more elaborate ones, and I'm just like, oh, this is the Alamo. But what's really interesting about it, and I was talking to one of your colleagues, was, you know, the fact that, so there's all these plaques all around it. Or there's like a part that's kind of an outdoor, like you can read these sort of historical timelines, like a timeline. And there's just so little mention of the role of slavery in all this. And then they make you watch a video too. And again, it's kind of like, that's still, you know, left out. But as a place where, you know, Mexico and the US start to define their relationship with each other, I mean, it can't be, I mean, it's kind of the beginning of that, really. I mean, you know, who is Mexico? And Mexico's trying to work out who it is, really. I mean, it's 20 years into independence. I mean, that's not very long. And it had, you know, it had its kind of failed empire first, and then it, you know, so Mexico's trying to work out who it is. The US is trying to work out who it is. And the US is, you know, kind of ready to keep pushing forward. And one of the things, and I write about it briefly in the book, and I just think it's absolutely fascinating, is during the Mexican-American War, and I know we're getting slightly away from Texas, but not by much, there was this idea that, you know, Texas become a state, you know, we're going to win this war. Why don't we just take all of Mexico? Why don't we just take the whole thing because we can? And the reason that the US doesn't try to do that is because they don't actually know what to do with all the people who live in it. They're like, oh, but we, you know, like John Calhoun kind of gets on the floor of the Senate and is like, well, we don't want a bunch of, you know, whatever, mixed blood. I think he refers to people as like mixed blood or something, you know, and it becomes this whole thing like, well, we don't want a bunch of Spanish speaking Catholics in our country, so let's just fight the war and take, you know, and we'll take the boundary north. And nobody really writes about the all Mexico moment. And I mean, I had to kind of scramble around to get some scholarship, but I found some of the debates and stuff, and it was just like, wow, like this, you know, where the US is mentally in this moment. And I would say, you know, arguably after 1836, it's already kind of in that space. But you know, the Alamo provides this really handy way to now talk about Santa Anna and Mexicans as, you know, kind of Black legend and stuff, really. Leyenda Negra, kind of in the 19th century, bloodthirsty and corrupt and violent, and, you know, all these sort of things. So the Alamo is, yeah, a very important site for that, for like kind of trying to make sense of US Mexican relations.
Thank you, Carrie. Yeah, I always, you know, when Hispanic History Month starts, I always share with my students, you know, it's the day the Mexican independence, you know, the day after the Mexican independence started. But it's also in many ways, you know, it's the first time that many of these territories with the Mexican Independence War were actually, slavery was abolished, right? You know, Miguel Hidalgo was the first time, the first priest to abolish slavery in all these former territories, and then it was reaffirmed in the 1821 Mexican Constitution, and then all that stories just get lost, right? Once those territories are part of a union. But it's something that I think, again, going back to the shared history, that I think is worth reminding, that the struggles actually started way before the Civil War and many of the elements, particularly in these territories of the United States. So I think I have many other questions, but I want to give a space for our students and folks that have joined us to ask some questions. So
right. Thank you, Carrie and Guillermo, for getting this conversation started. And we'll open it up to questions and answers now, and I'm happy to keep the queue. So if you want to use the raise hand function or just send me a note in the chat, I will put you in the queue, and I'll put myself in there as well. I'll try to let others go before me, but if not, I'll jump right in. So Carrie, you did an extensive amount of research for this book, and as a librarian, I'm curious as to whether you came across some interesting collections that stood out to you, if there are archives or particular libraries that you visited that stand out to you over the process of the research.
Yeah, I mean, UT Austin, the Briscoe Center was fantastic at UT Austin. Also, I believe it was at, wait, is the main bit of Texas A&M at Corpus Christi? No, it's a branch of Texas A&M at Corpus Christi, isn't it?
Right, correct.
Yeah.
And the main campus is in College Station.
That's right. But at Corpus Christi, and I could be wrong, I have to check my notes, but there's a whole, they've got part of like Hector Garcia's papers, and he was an important organizer, and he was from Corpus Christi. So that was really useful, because I went there, I spent about a week in Corpus Christi and used that special collection. Rice had a really interesting they just had kind of a variety of documents, some of them going back to early 19th century. It was kind of a wide range of stuff, but that was really useful in Houston. So yeah, I mean, a lot of things for the earlier period, I could get like the colonial period. I used the Archivo de Indias in Seville, because that's actually closer to get to from here than in Texas. Yeah, I found, I found that I scooted around a bit. And some of the places, and some of had collections that I was surprised with, because one of the things that's really challenging about doing history in the United States is there's so many universities, and they all have like really great special collections in their libraries, but it can be really scattered. Whereas here, because Britain's a lot smaller, things can be a little more centralized. You don't have to kind of go to quite so many different institutions or different places. But yeah, definitely Texas. Corpus Christi was really good. Rice was really good and really useful. And then where else did I go? I feel like it's like slightly blurring, because I kind of made multiple trips. Oh, the University of New Mexico had a really useful special collection too. So yeah, things are definitely kind of scattered around. Oh, and the one in UC Berkeley, the Bancroft Library. That's an excellent one, especially for California. But yeah, so there's a lot. There's so much out there that, I mean, I couldn't look at all of it. So there's a lot for future PhD historians who, if anybody gets tired of law school, wants to do a history PhD, there's plenty to work on.
Great, thank you. I think next we have Perrin and then Michael.
Hello, Professor Gibson. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. I have been struggling with Julia Scott's Uncommon Wind and the idea of sort of the stories we tell ourselves and the informal networks between free and unfree people. And I wanted to get your thoughts on sort of the Underground Railroad that headed from the north to the south through Texas and into Mexico. And I wonder what stories you have to tell about that sort of subversive idea where, we are headed south to freedom, that sort of runs counter to the Anglo story of righteousness.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Sorry, somebody's revving their engine outside, so I don't know if you can hear it, but there's a really loud car engine, and I think it's my obnoxious neighbor who has a very loud sports car. So sorry, apologies for that London noise. Common Wind and Julia Scott, that's a great book, and that's a real classic in the field of that I work on for sure. And I don't really talk about it enough in El Norte, actually. And it's funny because like after you write a book, you look back on it and you go, oh God, I didn't give that enough time. I didn't give that enough time. I feel like that with Empire's Crossroads too. And the nice thing is I'm writing a book about abolition. It's my next project. So this is going to definitely come into it because, in addition to everything you say, Mexico doesn't get enough credit for its early abolition because people go, well, yeah, but Mexico didn't have that many enslaved Africans at that point. It's like, right, but in the 16th century it did. Like, can we not just erase that enormous history that Nueva España had? But yeah, I mean, that's what's super interesting about the Underground Railroad going south, the South to Freedom thing, is that it absolutely challenges all kinds of narratives. And also, I mean, my understanding is that, I mean, partly it depends on proximity, because obviously Texas to the border is closer, but I don't really have a sense of numbers. And again, when I was researching this book, I feel like a book has come out in the last year or so about this. And it came out after El Norte was published. When somebody does some really good research, and you're like, oh, where was that book when I was looking for a good sort of monograph on this? But yeah, there's kind of definitely a lesser told story for sure about this. And like I say, I think it kind of fits with this idea of Mexico also being left out of its of its place with emancipation. And one of the things we have to remember is that when final emancipation happens in Mexico, it's under a president, Guerrero, who is part Afro-descendant. So, this is like a really important thing. And even I don't know where it necessarily sits in Mexican historiography, Guillermo. I don't know if people talk about that as kind of a point of pride, but yeah, I mean, what Mexico is doing to the South, and the fact that people from Texas and presumably, I'm going to say, Louisiana as well, and that kind of that. I mean, of course the word would have spread. Of course, people knew if you could get to Mexico, there would be freedom. And what's interesting too, and I write about this in the early chapters of El Norte, is that you had this situation back in the late 1600s, early 1700s between Florida and Georgia. So Britain claims Georgia, and Florida, basically the king passes a decree that allows any runaway enslaved people from Georgia to be freed, because it's kind of a way of getting at the British. So there was a South to freedom there too. And so this is kind of, yeah, like you say, there's like all kinds of things that kind of challenge the kind of primacy of the northern railway. There were all these other different routes to freedom, and that is something that's going to be coming up in the third book. But yeah, no, thank you for your question. Thanks.
Michael?
Oops. Oh, you have to forgive me. I'm sorry. I graduated this past May, and believe it or not, I already forgot how to use Zoom. Ms. Gibson, thank you so much for coming. My name is Michael Caso, and I was the Latinx Law Student Association's president last year until I graduated. I haven't gotten a chance to read the book, but Dean Alton, who is also on the Zoom call, hosted a Borderlands class at my university in Laredo, which borders Mexico. And I found it incredibly interesting, but some research that I had done on my own before getting into class, being Hispanic myself and being raised on the border, was a lot of familiarity with Octavio Paz's Labyrinth of Solitude, which is the Nobel winning book that he had published in the 50s. And one thing that I found incredibly daunting was just exactly what you mentioned, how history tends to be erased and how things also tend to be watered down. That tended to be a huge issue for me, because as a person whose ancestry is a Mexican or Spanish heritage, it's incredibly difficult to find direct lineages. Personally, I had some family members fight in the revolution. One of them assassinated by Mexican agents in Laredo themselves. And this is over 100 years ago, so there's no hard feelings, but the idea is we would have never found that out had it not been for researchers like yourself and for these kinds of books. So I want to just applaud you and thank you for that. And just also comment on how the heritage, or the norm, or the narrative rather, is just now, I think, coming to light. A lot of people talk about how social justice and all of these movements come along, but just as Aurelia had pointed out, there was a lot going on with slavery and with the fact that Mexico had abolished slavery much sooner than the United States. And obviously Texas not wanting to give up, well, first of all, convert to Catholicism, and also give up their slaves. It was incredibly, it was a much different narrative than I had received in middle school when I took Texas history, which is it's a required course in Texas. And they kind of said, well, they just wanted their independence from Big Bad Santa Anna. And, we go to the Battle of San Jacinto, where they basically, tied up the Mexican general and said, sign these papers. We're going to go ahead and get emancipated. And then the United States Army was kind of waiting across the border saying, yeah, we recognize it. It doesn't matter that Paris or the UK or no one else does. That's the Texas is independent now. But because of these works and because we continue to get more and more of these revelations, what is a way that as personally as Hispanics or as leaders in the Latinx community, how do we get to forward or rebuke that kind of narrative? Is it through social justice? Do we continue to be social justice warriors and type everything up on Twitter or continue to publish? Or I'm just kind of curious because I'm at a place in life where it's just like I kind of don't know where to go now. I want to be upset. I want to be angry. I also don't have time to publish or research. I just started a job at a firm a couple months ago. So it's getting that much more difficult to try to find some peace with the leaving academia behind.
Oh, thanks for your question. That's a tough one. I've said I went to Laredo and I found it amazing. It was fascinating, because it was a bit like, it was one of the few places, it's like Miami where, obviously when I speak Spanish, it's clear I'm not from a Spanish speaking family, but it's just one of those places that I could just switch into it and people didn't look at me funny. And I get that in Miami too. Like I can just talk Spanish and no one cares. In other places, it's kind of like, why are you speaking to me in Spanish?
Oh, so
I found like Laredo like super easy.
Having gone to TAMU, I actually wrote a paper on Spanglish and how it was becoming kind of like its own dialect in its own. And a lot of people kind of wanted to throw me into code switching. And it's like, no. Like I promise when you move down here or you live down here, it's its own thing. I hope you enjoyed the food. We had plenty of food.
Yeah, no, it was brilliant. And and what you say about the narrative coming to light, it's like, one of the reservations I had at all was even, well, what am I doing writing? Like, what does it even mean to be Hispanic, right? Like, what is, it's such a broad group. It's so diverse within that group. And that's part of the reason I wanted to bring it together, because it kind of pushes against that, to be a Cuban and to be from Laredo are very different experiences that kind of get under the same umbrella. So like, what does that mean? How does that, and I think part of it is, but like I kind of said in the introduction, part of what I was trying to do is like, but this is a group that also have these commonalities, that also has a commonality with the rest of the country. And so, that's why that history needs to be delineated, but also needs to be put in with the bigger picture. Does that make sense? So, so that narrative becomes one of many streams, right? So like, for instance, when I went to school in Georgia, I learned a lot about slavery, of course, because we were in Georgia. I didn't learn anything about the West. And it's like, to me, whatever state you're in, you learn both those stories, right? You learn that kind of integrated history. And it's just very hard because my understanding is every state, there's national curriculums, but then there's state curriculums. And it's like, how do you get all the states to even be on the same page with this? And it does feel kind of overwhelming at times. Like, what can a person do? Can you just sort of, armchair lob things on Twitter or whatever? And I would say the main thing really is to get people to read. It doesn't have to be my book, but just get them to, read history as much as you can, like promote it and have dialogues and have things where people can come together and talk about. There's so many good historians working on stuff. There's just so many. And
it kind of just I'm sorry to interrupt. It kind of just brings up the concept of corridos, which is just storytelling through narratives and through music and things like that. So I find that incredibly interesting. I just also just really quick, I to compare to contemporary events or things that are happening now. Obviously, we see with the Haitian crisis, or the persons rather trying to cross from Haiti, and we see those images of Border Patrol that really kind of took me back to those rinches.
The horses.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to get into a whole debate thing, but I had never heard of rinches until law school, and it was through reading Carlos Fuentes's book, and also with George Washington Gomez, and that's through by Americo Paredes, who was I think born in Brownsville and then was a professor at UT. But that kind of came hammering back, and it's just like where history tends to repeat itself. But there were so many stories, and that's kind of what I wanted to mention, and just thank you and appreciate it for the the narrative and the help that you've done to try to boost the work that you've done to boost that narrative. Because like I said, I grew up on the border and had no idea that the border was patrolled, by Texas Rangers and all that stuff.
And of course, the Texas Rangers is one of the fascinating things that I found is Texas Rangers actually started because they were trying to keep the Chinese out. Like, this is such a connected history, it's such a kind of global history. And I think just the more that people know, the more that they understand, it just helps, give that fuller picture. And it helps also just people break down their preconceived ideas, of what sort of Hispanicness even means, or, that sort of thing as well. So yeah, read more history. That's what I'm always going to say.
Great. Thank you. Andrea?
Hi, thank you so much. Professor Gibson, it's been so wonderful hearing you speak, and thank you to Professor Garcia Sanchez for inviting me. I absolutely loved your book. I'm maybe one of the few fellow historians in the group.
Oh.
And as a historian, I wanted to ask you a question about the periodization that you have chosen. As you mentioned in the beginning of your talk, you choose to start with Christopher Columbus and the arrival of Columbus. This is in contrast to the works of, for example, Fernández Armesto, which you also reference, and I'm sure you're very familiar with it. And I'm curious as to why you choose to start with Columbus as opposed to going back. I know this is always something we struggle with. You can always go further and further back and find more and more information. But I wonder the extent to which the periodization that you have chosen can give the impression that our commonality is a product of empire, as opposed to it being something that antecedes our colonial history and our imperial history. And lastly, this is not a question, but I'm probably sure that you're familiar with the book South to Freedom that just came out. If you're not, I wanted to recommend it to you. It's fantastic. And it'll definitely, I'm sure, be something that you engage with in your next project, which I'm very excited about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. Yes, South to Freedom, that's the one I was thinking of. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading that. Yeah, periodization is tricky because, well, partly the Columbus came in because my publisher was like, oh, you need to start with Columbus. And I'm like, oh, do I have to? Because I do Columbus in this book, and I do kind of pre-Columbus. I do kind of that kind of Mediterranean, the early expansion of empire. But so this is all kind of in there, like the Canary Islands and Madeira, and this kind of like this what goes on in sort of the 1400s. But I didn't want to get into all that with El Norte, just partly for space. But you raise a really important point that our commonality isn't just colonialism, and partly it's just my own strengths and weaknesses as a historian is that I wish I could have given like a better picture of kind of North America pre-European, because that's part of the story too, and that's just not my strong point. And again, there was like my space consideration, stuff like that. But yeah, obviously there's like this whole other history that has nothing to do with colonialism that predates Columbus, and that is part of this bigger story. And the same thing too, when we think about everything that's going on along the west coast of Africa, and that becomes folded into this story too. It's not just about European powers, but again, it was partly just sort of space constraints, strength constraints, because I know I'm not a Native Americanist, and it would take a long time to get my training up to the same speed as being a Hispanicist. And you know how difficult that kind of stuff is in the discipline of history. So it's kind of knowing what I didn't know. I was like, okay, this is kind of what I can do with what I've got. But I think that's a really, really important point, is that while in many ways the world we live in is a product of colonialism, that's not the only thing it is. And yeah, no, I thank you for that point. That's very, very important. So yeah, thank you for your question. I'm always delighted when another historian likes my book. That's it's always really nice.
Not only that one, but the one on the Caribbean is fantastic. I'm a historian.
Oh, thank you.
America, so I found it very useful. Your methodology is fantastic.
Oh, thank you. I felt like I should put more about the Mayans. And so there's always those things you look back on your book and you're like, oh, I should have done this and I should have done that. But yeah, with El Norte, I was like, oh, if I keep going like this, it's going to be 2 volumes. Then nobody's going to buy it, you know. So I wanted to keep it. Because the other thing is, I wanted to reach an audience that, you know, wanted to know more about this, and I didn't want it to be too much of a doorstopper. You know, I try to keep it, but it's hard because, like you say, when you start thinking about all these sort of things, there's just a lot to put in. But that's where things like the bibliography can be really helpful. And I keep a full bibliography on my website, so if you're really interested in any particular thing, you can see far more detail about what sources I use and stuff on my website.
Thank you.
Hey, I don't know if there's any other question, but I still have a bunch. I mean, I'm just fascinated by the book. So one of the questions that I had, or maybe more of a question, I would say an invitation to share at least 3, I would say, interesting facts of different periods that you would like, you know, the people to take home with them. You know, I always, every time I promote your book, I'm like, did you know that the Spanish governor of Florida helped Washington win the war? And there are people like, no, I had no idea. Did you know that the Spanish reached South Carolina before anyone else? Was like, oh, I had no idea. So it's, you know, those kind of things from the 3 different periods, like the colonial period, dependence period, and the contemporary, that, you know, people eye shocking. And that they can keep and bring to them to their family talks during Thanksgiving.
So 3 that just come to mind, and they're kind of in chronological order, is the first is like, what a failure the Spanish have in Florida. It's just hilarious. It's like Ponce de Leon tries twice. There's all these different schemes and nothing. It takes, so he tries in 1513, and St. Augustine gets established by 1565. But in the middle, basically all the indigenous people do a really great job at running everyone off, or there's shipwrecks, one of the 2. And it's like, you know, we don't kind of talk about that sort of thing, because, you know, so much of sort of colonial history is often presented as what goes right. And I just think what's fascinating is like what goes wrong. It's like, how did the Spanish actually manage this? You know, and they still managed to do it well before the English do. So despite all the failures as well. I just think thinking about Florida like that, like this kind of place that nobody can get a foothold in, doesn't really match up to how we think about it now. But it was like this kind of first bastion, and nobody was getting through. So the kind of Spanish failures in Florida are one thing. The second is Louisiana, and I do write about the plaques in New Orleans as in one of my chapters. And so I went to New Orleans many times when I was an undergraduate, because I went to the University of Georgia, and it was like within driving distance for spring break, which is very important. And so we would go down to New Orleans, and I never really thought anything of it, had a great time. I was in it French, blah, blah, blah. I come back as a historian 20 years later, and I'm like, wait a minute. This place is Spanish. What are you people talking about? So if you look, next time you go there, if you look, there's all these little plaques that say this used to be called the Plaza de Armas when this was Spanish Louisiana. And I just think the story of Spanish Louisiana is so interesting and so forgotten. I mean, even archivally, it's kind of shoved aside. Like there are legajos in the archive in Seville, but it's like Louisiana and like Florida, they're just kind of, it's not kind of the main draw. And yet it was an enormous territory, you know, it was enormous territory. This is what the US bought, you know, from when Spain gave it back to Napoleon. But that story of New Orleans and how we think about it as a French city, the Spanish rebuilt it after a fire in 1781, I think. And so if you go to New Orleans and then you go to Havana or San Juan, you're like, wait a minute. That's not to say there's not a French influence, but there's absolutely a Spanish one in Louisiana. And I think a lot of people don't know that. So I definitely talk about Spanish Louisiana. And then the third one is that California doesn't get settled by the Spanish until almost the time of, you know, US independence. I think when you actually think about those things together, you're like, whoa, wait a minute, you know, because again, it's kind of like, well, it became a state in 1850, but there must have been a lot of people out there. And it's like, well, they were Native Americans. There weren't many Europeans. And it wasn't till San Diego in 1769, and that's like a really, really late colony. And so California doesn't even enter this entire story until much, much, much later on. And again, I think because it's such a central state now, it's gotten such a lion's share of like 19th century history as well. But it's like, yeah, take it back a century, and it's like, oh, actually California was like a periphery. And again, I think that's just kind of something people don't realize, that, you know, it gets settled, and then all this time later, or, you know, sort of 6 years later, you're basically having the US Revolution. And Claudio Sant's book, oh, I can't remember the title of it. It's really, really good, and it kind of sets out that dichotomy really well, and kind of explores those sort of two things happening at the same time. I can't remember the name of the book, but the historian's Claudio Sant. But I didn't realize I'd be talking about that bit of California. But I do think, like, yeah, again, people kind of assume, well, California's always, you know, no, it was, you know, it didn't have a single Spanish settlement till the 1760s. So compared to, you know, Mexico City or other places in the 16th century. So yeah, those would be like three kind of off the top of my head takeaways.
Well, I think we're about time. I don't know if anyone wants to ask the last question. I'm gonna give it. Oh, well, thank you so much, Carrie, for joining us today here at A&M. Thank you so much to the Latinx Student Law Association for organizing this. Fabiola and everybody in the board did a great job of inviting Carrie and organizing this for us. And thank you for everyone outside of A&M joining us. I know Professor Dr. Oñate is at Cal Poly up in San Luis Obispo, so she can tell us one day what happened with North California.
Oh, thank you, everyone. It's been really great. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Carrie. On behalf of ELSA, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you again for the invite. It's been really great.
All right. Bye,
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank
Bye.
you.